36-day campaign to capture Iwo Jima was the bloodiest in the history of the U.S. Marines and the only one in which the Marine losses exceeded those of the Japanese. We'll talk with a World War II Marine veteran about the campaign and about last summer's pilgrimage to the island to commemorate the 55th anniversary of the battle. Let's take note with retired Colonel Gerald Russell, who served 28 years in the Marine Corps. He fought in the first U.S. offensive of World War II at Guadalcanal, was second in command of his battalion at Iwo Jima, and served as chief advisor at the frontline Korean Marine Brigade. Thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Iwo Jima is an 8 square mile volcanic rock, essentially. What was its strategic importance?
Well, by the time it was determined that we would make the landing on Iwo Jima, the Joint Chiefs of Staff felt that in order to land on the homeland of the mainland of Japan, it was necessary to knock out the military and industrial centers of Japan. The Army Air Corps at that time had only recently brought into their inventory this huge B-29 aircraft. And it was actually too late for the campaign in Germany. Germany was pretty much defeated by this time. So they used them in the Pacific War. They were based on Guam, Tinian, and Saipan, which had been captured prior to this time. The flight pattern that they used went directly north to the mainland of Japan, and in that route was this small island of Iwo Jima that had fighter aircraft and all kinds of warning systems, and it was directly in line of any of the bombardier flights going to Japan. They would alert the mainland, they would hit them going, and they would hit them coming. So we were beginning to experience considerable losses in this type aircraft. So it was determined to help alleviate that. The island had to be taken.
You landed on Iwo Jima on February 19th, 1945. You were the 3rd assault wave.
Yes.
And second in command. What was it like when you got there?
Well, there's so many different aspects of it. From a personal standpoint, it was one where, as I can recall, as we were moving in, I was in a landing boat, and in front of me were 2 waves of amphibian tractors. And at one point I saw a plane, one of our observation planes, shot down that landed between the waves and blew up. And then a little while later, one of our amphibian tractors was hit, and it blew up, and I knew exactly who was in it. It was part of our communications crew. And then when we landed, the Japanese commander, General Kurabayashi, had developed a different strategy than the Japanese had used to defend previous islands that Marines had taken. His concept was let the Marines land and let them get ashore and hit them after they landed. Prior to that time, the defense used by the Japanese was always hit them before they could land or hit them while they are landing. So his order was to hold fire until there was a grouping ashore, wait about 15 minutes, and unfortunately that was just about the time that I landed, and everything broke loose. There was an old Japanese supply ship, a lugger, that had been sunk and just drifted along the shoreline. And as we hit the beach, there were machine guns all over this craft, and it fired right down the beach, and we began to suffer pretty heavy casualties. The beach itself was this black volcanic ash. Iwo Jima is, part of it is an extinct volcano, so that the residue, the black sand is still there. Very soft, very difficult to climb up, and the waves had washed the beach so that it was a perpendicular rise. It wasn't a gradual rise, and for every foot that you made up, you slipped back 2 or 3. The important thing was to try to get the troops off the beach as quickly as possible, because we were getting such heavy casualties.
You said you paid dearly for every inch you took at Iwo Jima. You were fighting an enemy you couldn't even see. They were entrenched underground and in tunnels.
What our intelligence didn't completely show was that there are actually 22 kilometers of connecting tunnels, at least 30 feet below. There were complete rooms or hospital rooms. There were every kind of supply element there, so, and great stores of ammunition and everything that was necessary for a long stay, so that they were connected, so we could block and close off one, blow it up, and they just move into another part. So it made it so much more difficult. Added to that was the fact that the terrain, one of the things that struck me as being different, I couldn't figure out what it was at first, was the fact that when we landed, there wasn't the slightest amount of vegetation. It had been bombarded from the air, from the sea. There were battleships blasting away at it and everything, and there wasn't a shred of any kind of vegetation. It was totally denuded of any kind of vegetation. And now, these many years later, of course, it's all grown. But by virtue of that, we had very little place
to hide,
for
take
cover
cover
to hide, and so it made it that much more difficult.
You went with 1,200 troops, and soon there were 500 replacement troops. You talk about paying dearly with heavy casualties. What were the U.S. casualties?
We actually lost just under, for the whole operation, there were approximately 58,000 Marines involved in it. And the total number of casualties, there were almost 7,000, I think about 6,800 and something killed, another 19,000 wounded, and then there were about 2,500 other type of casualties. So there are about 29,000 casualties, so 1 out of every 2 almost was a casualty. And many of the 58,000 did not come ashore until the end of the operation. So I think in the early phases, just about everybody who went ashore was either killed or wounded.
In fact, of those 1,700, you were among the 270 who survived.
Yes.
How difficult was it for you to go back to Iwo Jima last summer?
Well, I had mixed emotions. I was curious to go back and see where, because we were so involved from the very beginning to the very end. There were reports, for example, that it was over at the end of about 28 or 30 days. Actually, we were involved right up to the 35th day. And I never had really a chance to look around or anything else, not that I was particularly interested at the time. But I was curious to see, and it seemed like a great opportunity. The trip involved stopovers at Guam, Saipan, and Tinian as well, so it was an opportunity to see a lot of the different Pacific battlegrounds where Marines in particular had been heavily involved.
Now, you were actually there on Iwo Jima Island when that famous, perhaps the most famous of all photographs, the Joseph Rosenthal photograph of the raising of the flag took place. What was it like when you saw that with your own eyes?
Well, it was my recollection. Well, it was the morning of the 5th day, and we weren't making progress by the yards. We were making what little progress by the inch, and we were as close to the ground as we could get. And there's a tremendous amount of noise. All kinds of guns were firing and so forth. And we knew that the mission of my unit was, if you recall, the shape of Iwo Jima is like a pear, and the stem end is where this Mount Suribachi is, which is about 500 meters high. The unit that landed on the beach next to me's mission was to go up and take that particular high ground. Our mission next, and right at the base of Mount Suribachi, was to cross over and cut the island in half and then move on up the other coast. So we were very much involved in that, and we were facing away from Mount Suribachi. And when the firing seemed, about mid-morning, seemed to be dropping off and lessening, and we kind of began to stand up straight and wondered what was going on. We weren't looking in the right direction. Finally, somebody happened to look up on the top of the mount, and we could see these tiny figures in good old glory up there. And I want to tell you that to me, that's one of the highlights of my lifetime. I was standing beside an old Marine gunnery sergeant who had been in the Marine Corps for about probably almost back to World War I. And he had one of the most colorfully profane vocabulary I think I've ever heard. He always had something very pungent to say about whatever the situation was. I never thought he had an emotion in his body. And I looked up at him, and at this point in time, our faces were covered with this dust and everything. And he had tears running down through the dust. We hadn't washed for 5 days.
And unfortunately, I have to stop you there. Thank you so much for being with us.
Are we finished? Oh my God.
Our guest has been Colonel Gerald Russell. He's a retired U.S. Marine. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia. We were talking yesterday, and you were telling us you saw with your own eyes what most Americans now view as perhaps the most famous photograph of all time, is the Joseph Rosenthal photograph of the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. What was that like?
The day that it occurred was the morning of the 5th day after we landed, and we were making extremely slow progress. My unit's mission was to land on beach Red 1 and cut across near the base of Mount Suribachi, which is at one end of the island, cut the island in half and then move on up the coast, so that by that time, the morning of the 5th day, we had already made the turn and we were moving up. So our backs was to Mount Suribachi. The gunfire had been extremely heavy, 24 hours a day from our side and theirs. We, at this particular point, noticed a cessation beginning, and it seemed to drop off, and where we had been forced to crawl rather than walk because we needed whatever protection we could get as close to the ground. We began to stand up, and we couldn't quite figure out what was occurring. We were again facing away from the mount. Somebody happened to turn around and look up, and we all turned in and see small figures on the top of the mount in good old glory. And has always been one of the, if not the highlight, one of the greatest moments of my lifetime, to look up and see the flag at a time when we were really being hit so heavily and even speculated whether we were going to be able to stay on the island. I was standing next to a big old Marine gunnery sergeant, a man who I never thought had any emotion at all, and a fella who had one of the most picturesquely profane vocabularies you could imagine. He always had something to describe every situation. At any rate, I looked at him, and at this point in time, we had had very little water to wash, just barely enough to drink. So we were caked with this black volcanic dust that is all over the island. And when I looked up at him, this person I thought had no emotion in his body. He had tears running down through the grime, and he said, "God, that's the most beautiful sight I have ever seen." And I think that typified it for all of us. It really meant so much.
And you have one of the original photographs.
I was fortunate enough to get from Joe Rosenthal after the operation a copy of it, and incidentally it's autographed by many, many of the commanders of the units who were in the campaign.
As I read about your landing on Red Beach on February 19th, 1945, I had visions of the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan. Is that a fair comparison?
Well, I think Iwo Jima was probably a little more intense, because in the Private Ryan film, they were spread out over a very wide area. The beach, or the beaches that we landed on, were very narrow, about 3,500 feet, so that the Japanese could concentrate all of their fire into that area. So I think our casualties were probably more severe. The landing beaches were much more difficult to maneuver on because of this soft, powdery, volcanic sand. So,
in fact, you talked about how dearly you paid for every inch you gained on Iwo Jima, and you talked about this black sand as being so hot that if you put your rations, dug it into the sand.
It was an interesting phenomenon. When I went back, I did get up on the top of Mount Suribachi and actually stood on the point where the flag was raised. Behind that is an extinct volcanic area. Behind it, the actual crater exists, and even now there is steam coming out of it, so that no matter where we were on that island, you could dig down about 6 or 8 inches. Most of our rations were canned. You could stick a can in the ground and cover it over, and in a half hour it would be well heated. When we dug foxholes, which we had to do all the time, we had to kind of let it cool before we could get in. So it was it's a very interesting, amazing phenomenon.
When you went back to Iwo Jima this past summer, did you make peace with the island? Was that part of what it was about?
It brought back a lot of memories, memories that I had tried to erase completely. I thought so much about my members of my unit who had been killed, and I had been able to kind of put it out of my mind for about 40 years at least. And as I stood on the beach by myself where we landed, a lot of this came back, and so from that, and I felt a little more comfortable with it, sort of reconciled to it.
So it was a good thing in a way as these memories came back.
I think it was, yeah.
It was an interesting place because as you talk about it, it seemed like such an inhospitable place. You talked about the heat and the smell and the sulfur, the smell of rotten eggs, and that was still there when you went back.
Yes.
In what way was it different the second time than it was
Well,
the first?
matter of fact, that's an interesting question. When we first got there and when I got up to the top of the mount, I felt that there was something dramatically different. And I realized that it was the vegetation. When we landed, by the time we did, all of the vegetation had been bombarded off. They had blasted the place with battleships and all types of other Navy ships. They had bombarded it from the air. So there wasn't a shred of vegetation around. We had no cover at all. Now it's pretty heavily overgrown and so forth. So that was a very significant difference, and it made the place look considerably different.
Now this commemoration, this was in honor not only of the losses and what happened to American troops, but also the Japanese. So this was a joint ceremony. Can you talk about
there
that?
were about 250 Japanese, and there are two monuments on the island. Matter of fact, I understand that one of them was provided by John Wayne, who was in a picture called The Sands of Iwo, and sometime
saw
in
as
the
a kid.
years back he provided it. At any rate, we were told, I was one of those 5 selected to lay a wreath on this joint monument. And the Japanese, we would do an aspect of the process, and then they would follow. We had interpreters. There were about 250 Japanese who had returned, many of them families of the Japanese veterans of Iwo Jima.
It's interesting. I read about the dedication of the ceremonies, and General Erskine said, "There is nothing I can say which is wholly adequate to this occasion. Only the accumulated praise of time will pay proper tribute to our valiant dead. Long after those who lament their immediate loss are themselves dead, these men will be mourned by the nation, for they are the nation's loss." And I'm wondering, as we talk about yours as the greatest generation, has the boomer generation paid proper tribute to the sacrifices that were made at Iwo Jima?
I think that's a difficult question to answer. It depends on what you're looking for. I'm not looking for any thanks for being involved in it. I only hope that they recognize what was involved as a part of maintaining our country as it is, and that if occasions should arise in the future where we needed that similar type of support, it would be forthcoming. That would be my wish and hope.
How important was the Battle at Iwo Jima to the U.S. Marine Corps? In the history of the U.S. Marine Corps, where does it rank?
Well, it's I think, another reflection of the competence of the Marines. It shows how capable they are. From the standpoint of that battle as it relates to World War II, as a part of World War II, I think there is an aspect of it that's often overlooked by historians. This was a perfect example, and I'll digress for a second and say, sometimes we hear that there are inter-service rivalries and so forth. This was a perfect example of the opposite. Iwo Jima was taken, one of its main objectives was to provide security for the B-29 aircraft that were bombarding the mainland of Japan. They were stationed on Saipan and Tinian, and they had to fly north to get to the mainland, and they would go right over Iwo Jima where there was a fighter squadron and all kinds of air warning systems. So we had very high casualties, but we saved a lot of Army Air Corps aircraft and crewmen.
And on that note, we're out of time. Thank you so much for being with us. Our guest has
Which
been
one?
Colonel Gerald Russell, U.S. Marine Corps retired. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia. I'm sorry.
Penn State on-demand videos are posted with additional online resources at live.psu.edu/VOD. Categories include Penn State Life, Research, Outdoors, Home and Garden, Arts, PA Stories, Health, Education, and World War II.